Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our event, Regulator and Regulated, What's the Right Relationship? This is the third event in our OFS Insight series, and this morning you are joining hundreds of people from across our higher education sector. We have students and student representatives, academic and administrative staff, representative bodies and mission groups, sector agencies, legal and consulting agencies, media, and of course, colleagues from across government and the devolved administrations, all joining us here. My name is Ed Davison, and I'm the Head of Office and Senior Policy Advisor to the Chair and Chief Executive. Before I hand over to Nicola Dandridge, our Chief Executive, I'm going to run through the agenda for this morning and give some brief housekeeping notices. You should now have the event agenda in front of you. And this event is in two parts with a quick break in the middle. We'll shortly be hearing from our Chief Executive, Nicola, and then our Chair, Sir Michael, will give his keynote address. The second part of the event will feature two keynotes on the topic, what's the point of regulation, followed by a panel discussion to examine the question, who makes the rules, principles versus rules-based regulation. The panel discussion will now be chaired by Nicola Dandridge. If you would like to refer to the agenda during the morning, we have pasted a link into the chat where you can find it online. We are keen to hear from the audience this morning, and there are two question and answer sessions built into our agenda. For both sessions, we are inviting you to submit questions using the Q&A box in Zoom. Questions will then be read aloud. If you are happy to have your name and organisation read out as part of that, then please do include these details when you type your question. If you do not include your name and organisation, then your question will remain anonymous. We will get through as many questions as we can during the Q&A, but it may not be possible to respond to each question. Please note, we are not using the chat function to receive questions. This will be reserved for speaking with a member of our events team. For example, if you have any technical questions about the agenda, timings, or event recording, then please do post those into the chat. We will be live tweeting from today's event using the hashtag OFS Insight. So please do use this, and you can follow the discussion online at Office Students. Live captions or subtitles are available and can be accessed by clicking on the CC icon in Zoom. Finally, the event this morning is being recorded and will be made available on our website later this week. I would now like to welcome our Chief Executive, Nicola Dandridge.
Thanks, Ed, and a very warm welcome to you all from me too. The focus of today's event is on regulation, the relationship between the regulator and those regulated. And we're also going to be covering the nature and implications of principles-based regulation. It's not that we're ignoring coronavirus. The pandemic has dominated more or less everything we've done this year. And I'm sure that the impact of the pandemic is going to be obvious in all our discussions and our exchanges. And as the regulator, we know what an extraordinarily challenging year it's been for all of you, students, universities and colleges alike. But what we are wanting to do today is to look beyond the pandemic. And the context is a series of consultations that we, the OFS, either have or will be publishing this winter as we review and reset our regulatory requirements. And the first one, as many of you will know, was the consultation on quality and standards that we published a few weeks ago. So as part of this process, we want to look at the relationship that the Office for Students have with those we regulate and consider what both students and higher education providers want to see from the regulator in the future. And we also want to draw on insights and experiences from other sectors. Our insight events, such as this one, are intended to promote debate and discussion, and they are also about us listening to you and your views, and we will be taking account and reflecting on what you've said today. We've specifically allowed about 45 minutes overall for your questions and contributions, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. So please do therefore submit your questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So with that, by way of introduction, let's turn to our first keynote speaker, Sir Michael Barber. Michael, I'm not sure I need to welcome you to your own event, but anyway, perhaps I could just say good morning and over to you.
Well, thank you, Nicola, and thanks everybody for putting this event together, and especially for all of those very impressive large numbers of people attending. It is an important theme for us and for the future of the higher education sector, and obviously for students, not just today's students, but students in the future. So I'm really glad there's such interest in this, and we really look forward to debating it. We've sought from our establishment in the legislation in 2017 and effectively as an organisation from 2018 to be in dialogue with the sector we're regulating, so that we learn as we go how to be an effective regulator, and we've got some things right and some things wrong, and we've moved on and we've learnt. But our approach, one of the reasons for this event is to put our approach under greater scrutiny, because we want to learn how to be continuously better than we've been before. And I'll come to what good looks like later on in what I want to say. And we have throughout, as Nicola's already mentioned, taken a principles-based approach to regulation rather than a rules-based. And again, that will be debated through the morning. I want to deal with three things. First of all, what is the rationale for any kind of regulation in this sector, and what approach have we taken? Secondly, what have we learnt from the first 2.5 full years of operation, and what reflections do I have on that? And then thirdly, what does success look like, and what can we learn from other sectors internationally and abroad that might be helpful? And of course, that will come up later on in the panel. So starting with that first theme, the way I think about this is there's always, of course, been competition in the higher education sector in England. It's been there since the beginning, since Oxford and Cambridge tried to prevent the establishment of UCL back in the 1820s, right through. But in the early part of the last decade, a market was really vigorously put in place by two things. One, the implementation of the tuition fees regime following the Brown Review of higher education funding in 2011. And then in 2013, the lifting of the numbers cap on how many students each university should recruit. And what that did was quite consciously put a market into action. And the regulator was established in 2017, so a few years after the market had already been created. That's different from many sectors where the regulator and the market are created in one piece of legislation. So we were established in 2018, as you know, and the rationale for a regulator in our sector is, among other things, to ensure that the excesses of the unregulated market are restrained. And that's a lot of what we've been doing. We've been restraining a previously unregulated market. So if you think of the work we've done on senior staff pay, on trying to mitigate the rising grade inflation, of trying to prevent and indeed preventing the abuse of unconditional offers, and still to come, the identification of courses that are of low value for money, but still charge the same fee as everything else. So there's a whole set of issues that arose because there was an unregulated market, and by putting a regulator in place, we've been restraining some of those aspects of the previously unregulated market. But the broader justification is that the higher education sector is fundamentally important to our future as a country, our social future, social mobility I'll come to in a minute, our cultural future, all the extraordinary outputs from universities and colleges and institutions across the country, our professions, and of course our economy. So the other sort of big underlying reason is we want a thriving higher education sector now and in the future, and that does require some kind of regulation to create the context in which individual institutions can thrive. And it needs to be regulated particularly in the interests of students, but not just today's students, but tomorrow's students, in the near future and in the more distant future. So when you're trying to restrain grade inflation, one of the things you're thinking about as a regulator is, what will a degree be worth in 5, 10, 15 years? When somebody says, I went to the University of X, I've got a degree like this, will it still have its value over that length of time? So that, in a word, that's about stewardship. So in addition to restraining the unregulated market, we're taking a stewardship view of leaving the sector better than we found it for students in the future and for the country in the future. Now, in that stewardship role, we've taken two themes to be really important above all. One is access and participation, because we want access to be fair and participation to be fair and respected, regardless of where you are in the country and regardless of your social background. And then the second thing is quality and standards. Is a degree worth all it's cracked up to be? And I don't just mean financially, I mean in a much broader definition. So those two things have been central to our regulation. If there wasn't a regulator, those two things wouldn't get done. A completely unregulated market wouldn't deliver those two things necessarily. And then behind the scenes, we've been regulating to check on financial sustainability, because that's a necessary precondition of the system surviving and thriving into the future. So that's the rationale that we've taken for the approach we've adopted. The second thing I wanted to talk about is, having tried to do that over two to 3 years now, what are my reflections on that? Well, the first thing to say is it's hard to set up a new regulator under pressure with the market already running freely, and therefore you needing to sort of get control of something that's already been let rip without regulation. So it's been demanding in practice. And it's not just about the things you do, it's about the tone with which you do them. And we've sometimes got that right, but not always. We work on that all the time. So that's one reflection. The second is the shift from a funding council, which is what our predecessor body was, to a regulator, is quite a big culture shift, both internally for us, and you can ask questions about that, but also for the sector itself. I've often sensed a dilemma in the sector where the message from university leaders and academics is, we're autonomous institutions, we've got academic freedom, and we as a regulator totally support that sense of and plea for autonomy. But then the same people who say they want autonomy then say, why won't you bail us out? And the answer to that is, autonomy means taking responsibility for your decisions. That's what autonomy means. And so if you're autonomous, it's inconsistent with the idea of a bailout. Or autonomy, people say we want autonomy, and then when something like the pandemic comes up, or even a more minor problem, people say, what are you going to do? It reminds me of the debate I used to have with head teachers when I did school reform, where the head teachers say, give us the money and get out of the way so we can just manage our schools. And then as soon as a problem that comes up, they say, what's the government going to do about it? And the two ideas are inconsistent. Keith Joseph once said all those years ago, the first words a baby learns in Britain, what's the government going to do about it? And there's a sense in which that's right. So that dilemma of encouraging autonomy, creating a context for autonomous institutions to succeed at the same time as helping the sector come through the challenges it's bound to face in the century we're in, is a dilemma all the time, and we're constantly reflecting on it. And the quality of our dialogue with institutions individually and collectively, through people like Julia Buckingham, who's on the programme later, this is all very, very important for us to get right. We've worked on three themes, if I mentioned. One is access and participation, and the sector has responded incredibly well to the drive that we're trying to institute for fairer access, for a better sense of progression through university and into the labour market. And we're really excited about what universities have done in response to us. So, and if all the universities put together succeed in what we've asked, what they've told us they're going to do, we will have the Black achievement gap halved within 5 years across our country. We'll have 6,500 extra students going to high tariff institutions from the lowest income quintile. And this is really exciting stuff. So we've really emphasized access and participation and had a fantastic response from the sector, because I think across the sector, people believe in that agenda and want it to succeed and are ambitious for it. So we've seen really good progress there. And then on quality and standards, our basic approach there has been to use transparency to publish the data, for example, on grade inflation, and then to follow up quietly behind the scenes with institutions where the data is harder to explain. And we've made some progress on that. And now we're consulting, as you know, on raising the bar on quality. And then through all of that over the last few years, the other big task has been registering over 400 institutions. That task is now complete. There'll be small numbers of new people coming to the register at any given moment, but that's been a big one-off task to get us to a new baseline. And then thrown into all of that, you get the pandemic. And that's been obviously challenging at every level in the system. And I want to take this opportunity to say to people in the sector and in universities and higher education institutions across the country that I am tremendously impressed by the way people have handled that set of challenges. We've tried to help the sector manage those challenges. We've worked much more closely with the sector and government in a kind of integrated way as far as possible than a normal regulator would want to do, because it is an unprecedented crisis. And we've we're not out of the pandemic totally, but we are coming out the other side. And I think there are three things that will now be important to us, that we don't lose sight of what we've always been working on, like on access and participation, that we do raise the bar on quality, and that there's a kind of general sense of building, renewing, sustaining pride in the sector across the country. It's one of Britain's most precious resources, one of assets, something that we have to foster and sustain. But also we as an institution think we can help by reducing the bureaucratic burden on the majority of providers. There'll be some that are facing particular challenges, but for the vast majority of institutions, that should be a significant and noticeable reduction in the bureaucratic burden. And then the last theme I wanted to talk about very briefly is learning from others and what counts as success for a regulator. And there are three things I want to say about that. One is, the main task is to create the conditions in which the regulated can thrive. So we don't do things, we create the conditions in which higher institutions do things, and they do wonderful things. And our job is to create the conditions that enable them to be successful within a fair access system, within a system that meets the interests of students, short, medium, and long term, and so on. But basically, creating the conditions is task one. Then we can measure our success, I hope, in 2 or 3 years, whether we've got absolutely demonstrable better outcomes on access and participation, social mobility, quality, standards, and public confidence, both in this country and abroad. And if we achieved all that, it wouldn't be actually our achievement. We'd have created the conditions in which the university sector, the higher education institutions of our country did that. But we would want to be measured by real outcomes in those areas. So what did happen will be something people will ask about us. And then the final point I want to make is they'll also ask about what did not happen. Because one of the ways you measure the success of a regulator is what you prevented. And it's easy to miss these things. At the beginning of the year, people were talking about multiple institutions going under into financial meltdown. It hasn't happened. It's not to say we're out of the woods. It could happen in 2021. But that's a sign, that's something that didn't happen. And it's important that it didn't happen, because it's important for the students of those institutions, but also for the sector's reputation as a whole. We haven't had a whole system-wide financial meltdown. The government helped with that, but above all, the leaders of universities have managed their finances generally speaking, extremely well through a very challenging time indeed. We haven't had the catastrophic fall in overseas student numbers that we feared we might have. It's dropped, but it's not gone away in the ways that we feared. And we were predicting, or people were predicting, a fall in home student numbers. That hasn't happened. We've had an increase. So for all those reasons, a regulator should be measured by, did they create the context for the regulated to thrive? What did happen? And can you see the benefits of that measurably? And what didn't happen? What was prevented? And then the last point I'll make as I wrap this up is, I think the sector's demonstrated enormous resilience through this year, and that is a huge thing that gives me confidence for the future of our higher education system. I'm reviewing the digital teaching and learning, the experience of that over the last few months, so that we can look ahead with the sector at the next academic year, but more importantly beyond that, to see how digital teaching and learning can play a part, blended with other approaches, including obviously face-to-face learning, to make teaching and learning even better in the future. And if the health crisis is coming towards an end, as the Chancellor said, but the economic crisis is only just beginning, we've still got challenges ahead for 2021. But actually, the experience of the pandemic and the approach to regulation I've described actually gives me a lot of confidence that we're well placed for the future. And although it's been a tough year for everyone, we should have that confidence in the sector. We should have the confidence that the regulator knows what it's doing and is learning all the time. And as I keep saying, I've said right from the beginning, golden ages don't have to be in the past.
Thank you very much, Michael. What a rich and thoughtful presentation, and provocative, and I can see that there are already many questions coming in, but I'm afraid I'm going to sneak in quickly first of all and ask a couple of you based on what you've just said. We know, Michael, that a lot of universities and colleges would find it easier if we didn't go down the principle-based approach to regulation. And we hear that if we adopted a more rules-based approach, it would make it easier for them to follow what it is that we required of them. And the problem, they say, with principles-based is that it can generate uncertainty for those being regulated. So can you just say why you think that our principles-based approach is still right for the sector?
Yes, I can. I mean, I think, but it's a very good question, and it's one you and I debate, Nicola, as your senior team does, and as the board does periodically, because it is something we need to keep under review. But the first thing I'd say about this is, if you wanted a rules-based approach, the one thing that stands in the way of that is the higher education sector in England is incredibly diverse, and to write one set of rules for such an incredibly diverse sector, everything from the Dyson Institute to the Royal College of Music to the University of Liverpool to Barking and Dagenham College. You look across the spectrum and you think, could we really have a simple, clear set of rules that would tell everybody what to do in those immensely diverse institutions? And I think they would get very complicated, truthfully. That's the first problem with the rules base. The second is, and we've seen it this year more than ever, but it's true every year, the sector is constantly changing, the context is constantly changing, the world is constantly changing around. So the rules would have to be changed to keep up with the pace of change in the world. So you'd be, not only would you have a lot of complicated rules, you'd be rewriting them all the time. I came across this years ago in other sectors, like in Ofsted, which I was, when I was doing the school reforms, a big fan of the idea of Ofsted, but the Ofsted inspectors were inspecting according to a framework which was always out of date with the cutting edge of the profession, and keeping the inspectors trained and up to date. So I remember when we introduced the literacy hour, you have to make sure the inspectors know what a good literacy hour looks like, because they haven't been doing that before. So your regulator gets behind the cutting edge, particularly where there's innovation. I remember when the teacher training agency, as was back in the year 2000, couldn't quite work out what to do with Teach First, which since then has been an immense success, but the rules they had didn't actually allow for it. That had to be adapted and refined. So rules-based regulation, actually across a sector so diverse in a world changing this fast, will be very, very difficult and would become incredibly bureaucratic. So principles-based does create a degree of uncertainty, but it's much, much better than a rules-based approach. And the crucial thing about a principles-based approach is the quality of the dialogue between the regulator and the regulated. And that's why I'm really glad Julia's on our panel, but it's also why you and I spend a lot of time in debate with people at universities themselves.
And I suspect we're going to come back to this issue later on in the session as well. Michael, a quick final question from me. You spoke, excuse me, you spoke about our ambitions for access and participation and social mobility. And yet this comes in the context of a pandemic where school pupils, for example, have missed months of education. And that has particularly hit pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. Do you think it's realistic and sensible to regulate on access and participation during a global pandemic of this scale?
A short answer to that is I do think that. Let me give you some examples from my other work outside of higher education. So in 2011, I was starting what became 10 years of work, or nearly 10 years of work in Pakistan on school reform. And I went to an event in Islamabad in August of 2011, or maybe early September. And they'd had a flood that covered more than the size of England. And all the people who did school reform had rightly been taken off their duties to manage the catastrophic consequences of this flood. So when I turned up from Britain to talk to them about school reform, they said, well, we've had a flood, we can't do school reform anymore. And I faced a dilemma at that point. I could have said, actually, look, I really sympathise. It must have been absolutely horrible. Let's talk about that. But what I actually said was, did the flood make your schools better? And when I think about the pandemic, I think, yeah, the pandemic has been very damaging to some students in some schools. It's been a challenge for the university sector. But did the pandemic make access and participation better? No, it didn't. Did we think before the pandemic access and participation was a big challenge? Yes, we did. So what do we think now? We think it's an even bigger challenge, and we are collectively going to tackle it.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to move now to questions from the audience. We've got a lot coming through, and I'm going to start with one that picks up on your comment about institutional autonomy and bailouts. You can't have both institutional autonomy and bailouts, you say. So where do you see the balance between a competitive corporate market and a publicly funded, publicly supported market?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, bailout, in as I understood it, when people were asking about that when we were first new, it was if a university runs into financial trouble, will the OFS come up with a sum of money and just say, yeah, don't worry about it, we've sorted it out? Because if we did that, then the leaders of universities, the temptation would not be to take responsible decisions because you're going to be bailed out. So it's very important that we got that message across. But look, the public funding, the way public funding goes into universities is diverse, as everybody knows. Some of it's through the research system, some of it's through the funds that we allocate and so on. But a lot of it is going through the student tuition fees, where the student is ultimately paying, but in the short term, the Treasury is paying, and the student never pays back if they don't earn certain amounts of money. And that is a demand, rightly, on the public purse. And so what we've got to do is create a context in which students are making choices freely in their own interests, short and long term, but also that they're getting good information, they're making good decisions, and then they're getting value for money when they do go to university. And that's what we've been trying to do. And that's where the bulk of public funding that goes into universities is actually coming in. It's through the Treasury support for students, so that they don't have the pressure of paying fees up front. They only pay them in retrospect when they're earning decent sums of money. So I think that's where the balance is. And as I argued right at the beginning, I'm saying the reason you need a regulator is because in our sector, the unregulated market actually doesn't deliver on access and participation and doesn't deliver on quality and standards and probably couldn't. So it is really important to have a regulator.
Yeah, it's fair to say, isn't it? We spend a lot of time talking about exactly this issue. It's a really complex and important point. There's a lot of questions. Another one that's come in, is the OFS moving towards an Ofsted model of regulation?
I think the answer to that is no, although I think Ofsted's rethinking. I don't know how that rethinking is going, slightly out of touch, but no, I don't think we are moving to an Ofsted style regulation. I don't think, the Ofsted is the classic Ofsted that I knew and I was going to say knew and loved, but anyway, knew and respected back then was basically, this is what a good school looks like. And now we're going to inspect to check that it's meeting the 4 headings of the then Ofsted framework. We're not going down that road, partly for the reasons I've just given. It's a very, very diverse sector, and you do want to encourage autonomy. Autonomy of institutions is written into the Act. We have to have regard for that. But we do that anyway because we believe in it. It's very important. So you don't want an Ofsted style inspection. What you do want, though, is some way of getting a handle on quality, setting a high bar so that every student can have confidence that whatever course they choose, that is actually a good course. And that's what the consultation that is currently out there is all about. But no, we're not moving in the direction of Ofsted.
There's a question here, Michael, which actually picks up on your last point there, your last comment, and also on the reference you made in your presentation to value for money. So the question is this: what does value for money mean? Is salary the best measure of value? If not, what else? And how do you measure it? And how do you weigh it against other measures?
I think the most important perspective on value for money is from the student perspective. So a student, they may not be paying up front, but if after they've graduated and they leave university and they're earning a decent amount of money, they will be repaying some or all of the fees that they borrowed. And the most important thing is that they get the course they choose and the teaching they get and the experience they have and the person they leave the institution as, that feels like, broadly speaking, value for money. They're better prepared for the 21st century that they're going to not just live through, but hopefully shape in a positive way. So that's how I think about value for money. Obviously, institutions can, you can look at it from a more accountancy perspective, which is also important. You know, am I spending more than other institutions on this function or that function? Are there better ways of getting value for money? One thing in this world of very expensive platforms and for IT and so on, should universities be collaborating to do some of the things where they're spending big capital money? All kinds of things like that are worth thinking about. But ultimately, value for money is about value for money for the student, not just this year and next year, but throughout.
And it's worth adding actually here, Michael, that when we commissioned that report, just when we were first set up way back in beginning of 2018, and we asked that question of a bunch of students what they considered value for money, I remember so clearly that what came over really strongly was quality of teaching. That was one of the overriding issues that students identified, which I thought was immensely reassuring, because that's such an important part of what we do. Absolutely.
And when I speak with students, which I do on all my university visits, it's obviously been harder this year, but I've visited 40 or so nevertheless. And what you hear from students again and again is the things they want are really high quality teaching, really good prompt one-to-one feedback on assignments, and really good access to course materials, to the library, and spaces in which to study. Now, obviously, a lot of that's been disrupted this year. Credit to universities for managing through that. Some of it's been really good. We can build on that in the future. But that's what value for money feels like day to day. I totally agree. And the questioner asked about salaries. That's only one angle on it. It's where some of those began to look out of kilter and were affecting the reputation of the sector in the country.
Though, I mean, it's worth saying on that we are not proposing salaries as a measure of value for money in our proposed quality and standards consultation. That often gets thrown back at me. Why are you measuring quality by reference to salary? And the answer is we're very interested in graduate outcomes in terms of whether people get a job, but that's a different point, because some people go on to have fantastic careers but maybe not earn very much, and I think that's a totally fine outcome.
Yes. And we've had this talk about social value. So if university trains a lot of teachers who become good teachers for the next 40 years, they may not earn as much as somebody who did economics and then went into the city from the LSE, but they're making an immense social contribution. The same with nurses. Increasingly, policing is becoming a graduate profession, doctors and lawyers already. So the training of professions, the value of the work you can do afterwards isn't just measured by salary. And we're really clear that Leo data, while interesting and important, is by no means the sole measure of what matters.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question that's come in about principles-based regulation, and the person asking it says that principles-based regulation does work and is, in most cases, is a more workable approach. However, principles-based regulation works well only if examples of what does good look like be clearly provided by the regulator. So what's your view on how we demonstrate what good looks like?
I think it's a very good question, and I basically agree with the observation. You do need, if you're working your way through if you're running an institution in a principles-based regulatory system, having some idea of what the definition of good is actually important. And the dilemma we face as a regulator is you don't want to start over defining what good looks like, because it's not for us, it's for the autonomous institutions. But if you don't define it at all, it's very difficult for people. And I think we've debated it, and I think it is a dilemma for the regulator as well as the regulated. But we have, for example, on access and participation now, we have, there's a whole website where you can check the TASO, whatever it's called, where you can check lots of good practice out there. And so I think we can assemble and work with the UK and Julia and others to make sure that there are visible examples of best or interesting or good innovative practice.
Yeah, and in fact, we were, as it happens, just talking about this yesterday, that in many ways a regulator is set up to stop bad things from happening, and it's rather a sort of negative lens that frames our approach. But you're absolutely right, Michael, unless you've got that eye on what good looks like, then it becomes a very sort of reductive narrative.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. But I also agree, we're one job of a regulator is to stop bad things happening as far as possible. And it means it's very hard to define your success or to measure your success, because on that particular point, success is that thing not happening. And so obviously it doesn't register in the data.
Yeah.
Same theoretical problem that, say, MI5 has, where success is no terrorist incidents. But how do you measure that if you're them?
Yeah, exactly. And as you said in your presentation, we need to look at what didn't happen over the last year, and that's pretty significant. I've got a question here about the range of providers that we regulate. And from their perspective, they have seen administration and regulation increase, and smaller providers may simply not have the resources to keep up. How can we adapt our approach to help smaller providers?
Yeah, one of the things I've tried to do in my visits is to make sure I go to the full range, both geographically and in types of provider over the last 4 years, and it's been eye-opening. And I do agree, actually, particularly in the first phase that we've been through, getting everybody registered, inevitably that what we have asked people to do did demand more and put more pressure on smaller institutions. Many of those small institutions are a vitally important part of the future. And as we reduce the bureaucratic burden, as I've said, and I know you're strongly committed to, Nicola, we do need to think about how that affects smaller institutions, and we should be constantly in dialogue with them. But I do think, I'm confident that successful smaller institutions will find that the bureaucratic burden does now drop after we've done this initial phase of registering everybody. And then obviously the pandemic's had its own consequences.
Michael, there's time for one final question, but you're going to have to give a shortish answer. Sorry, all your answers are very short and concise, but we're slightly coming towards the end now, unfortunately, and there's a lot of questions I haven't got to, I'm afraid. Principles-based regulation requires respectful, constructive relationships between regulator and regulated. Here, I say agree. But how do you think such relationships can be fostered?
Well, I mentioned earlier on, getting the tone right is really important. And once or twice over the last 2 or 3 years, we've sounded a little bit tone deaf sometimes, and so we constantly getting the tone right, so we can be quite demanding, but get the tone right, I think is important. And I think we're getting much better at that, and that's important. The second thing is to be constantly in dialogue with the sector, particularly the people closer to the cutting edge of the sector, so that we're really hearing where the system is going. And that means being constantly in touch. And your colleagues in the OFS, Nicola, are constantly in touch and have been, particularly through this pandemic year. So I think we're doing some of those things right. And being willing periodically to recognize that you've made a mistake and you haven't got it quite right, because the world is changing fast, the sector is diverse, and you're not always going to get everything right first time, although obviously you should try.
I agree with that. And actually, I think it's really important if, well, not just universities and colleges, but also students, just let us know when they think we haven't got something right or where we are getting it right. Just and exactly in this event now, I think it's hugely valuable.
I totally agree. And we there's lots of ways of doing that electronically, and we do surveys, and the NSS has been very important. And so there's lots of ways of being in touch, but any individual institution, person in an institution, student can always be in touch with us, and that is helpful to helping us get things right.
Thank you, Michael, very much. I'm afraid there are questions that we've simply run out of time to ask, but I'll see if I can bring them in later. Really thoughtful and informative and constructive contributions and reflections, Michael. Thank you so much. And do stay with us. And now we're going to be taking a short break of 10 minutes. So we will start again at 10:50. So I will look forward to seeing you shortly.